Hi everyone, Sam here. Welcome to another episode of Azure Snippets. Today we're going to be taking a look at Azure Alerts. As the name suggests, Azure Alerts are Azure's way of allowing you to configure notifications when specific events happen within your resources, usually based on metrics around those resources. So today we're going to have a look at how Azure Alerts work, how you set them up, and the different options you have for using those so that you can set up your monitoring and alerting systems within Azure. So over in the Azure portal, we're going to head over to the Alerts option. And in here, if we had any, you would see all the alerts listed, and we're going to go through the process of creating a new alert rule. So we click on the New Alert button, and the first thing we need to do is select the resource we're going to monitor. So for the minute, we're going to stick to monitoring a specific resource. We'll look at other options later, but for now, we're going to have a look at how we monitor a specific virtual machine. So we'll come in here. It's pick my subscription. I'm going to go and pick by resource type and look for virtual machine. And I've only got one config on this subscription, so we're going to select that one as the one we want to look at. So I've picked the resource. Now we need to pick the condition. So the condition is what will trigger an alert. So first up, we need to decide what metric we're interested in. And what you'll notice on all these metrics are pulled directly from Azure Monitor. So effectively what we're doing is we're taking the Azure Monitor data that we can view in the portal and show graphs for and all that sort of thing, and apply alerts to those specific metrics. So we're going to look at a really simple one. We want to look at the percentage CPU use. Okay, so now we've picked the signal, as they call it, we now need to define the logic of when we want to configure an alert on this. So you can see here, first up we get a graph of the actual usage of that VM. Now this machine's turned off, so it's probably not terribly useful. If we look at that over the last week, yeah, we can see some metric over here. But what we need to configure is, okay, well, when do we want to trigger this alert? What value of CPU usage is going to trigger it? And we have two options. The first one is static, which is your sort of standard traditional way of doing this. So you say, okay, if the CPU average is greater than 90%, then we want to trigger the alert. And we can configure things down here like the granularity period. So this is the period over which the function is looking to see whether the average over 5 minutes is 90%. And then the frequency of the evaluation is how often it is evaluating the rule. So every 1 minute it will look at the last 5 minutes of data and will look to see if the average is over 90%. So that's the static approach. The other option, which is a new feature, is dynamic. So if we click on dynamic, what this is doing is instead of saying yes, 90% is the metric where I want my alert to be triggered, what we're actually saying is I want to have an alert when things are operating above what they normally do. So if this VM uses 20% of its CPU on average over most of its workloads, then we want Azure to work out itself whether a rise in CPU use is significant. So I'm not setting a threshold, I'm saying alert me if the CPU usage on this VM has varied significantly above what this machine normally does. And that's quite a nice tool because it allows you to have Azure tailor the alert specifically to your workloads to spot things out of the ordinary. Because on a static alert, if we set 90%, but if we have a VM that does very little, it's using 10% of its CPU most of the time, a spike up to 50% might actually be quite unusual for that VM, but we're not going to pick it up, whereas dynamic will note that. So you can see here we've still got our operator section, but instead of a value we've got this threshold sensitivity. So this determines how sensitive Azure is to a change in this particular metric before it triggers an alert. And so you've got high, medium or low. So in this case with CPU usage, if we selected high, then it would be very sensitive to changes. So any variation above the normal for this VM would trigger an alert. Whereas if we set it to low, then it would be much more forgiving to changes, and so you'd have to have a fairly significant deviation from the norm for this to pick it up and trigger an alert. So you can select how sensitive it is, how likely it is to alert you based on changes using that threshold sensitivity. this hopefully avoids you having to set different levels of, or different thresholds for different machines based on their workloads. You can use the dynamic approach from there. So we're going to use dynamic. We're going to pick medium. We're going to leave everything else alone, and we'll click done. So now we've got our resource picked, we've got our condition picked. The last thing we need to do is to configure what actually happens when an alert is triggered. So action groups are Azure's feature for configuring something to happen on alert. So action groups are separate objects, you can configure those, and then you can have multiple alerts using the same action groups. So we're going to create a new action group rather than adding an existing one. So if we create that, and we'll just give it a quick name. And these have to be created somewhere, so we're going to let it create a resource group. And then we need to give it the action. And you can have multiple actions. And the options for actions are fairly open. So you can have it send an email, or a SMS message, or a voice call. It can do that, and that's kind of what most people use. But you can also have it do other things. So you can have it call a logic app. So let's say if this particular alert, if we've got 90% CPU usage on that VM, then we're going to reboot the VM. It's pretty drastic, but we can do that. So we can have it fire a logic app, and the logic app can run some workflow that goes and talks to the ARM API and triggers a reboot. We could do similar things with Azure Function or an automation runbook. We can have it connect to our ITSM, so ServiceNow, similar things like that. And we can have it call a webhook. So the webhook options down here are kind of your get out of jail free option. Anything that's got a webhook, this could potentially call. So if you wanted to go and call out to Slack, for example, or something like that, then you could use a webhook. I think there might actually be a logic app connected for that as well. But yeah, similar things. You can have it call that. We could easily create a logic app that put a message into Teams. You can do whatever you want. We're just going to do an email. And we'll go ahead and put my email in. We'll spell it correctly. And you've got the option there instead to use SMS or push notifications or voice call as well. But we're just going to do that. And we'll click OK. Just call that email. And that's it. Everything is set up. We just need to give the alert a name. And we can pick a severity. So if this alert triggers, what severity is it? We'll call that a severity 2. And we'll have it enabled, and we'll create the rule. We can now see our alerts configured here and ready to go. And as soon as that trigger happens, we would see a message emailed to that action group. And if we have a look at our action groups, we can see the different action groups as well. So you can configure as many action groups as you want. Generally, you want to keep them as small as possible because remember, you can reuse action groups. So unless you need specific things to happen on an alert, if it's just sending an email, you probably want to create a few action groups for specific email groups and then reuse those. Now in that previous alert, we set up the alert specifically for one virtual machine. But having to go and create alerts for every single machine individually would be a pain, particularly if you're trying to monitor a common thing like CPU usage. So instead, what you can also do is if you go into the alert rules and go back into select resource, and this time we'll have a look at app services. You see I've got a couple of app services. If I just select the subscription level, you see down here is that it actually shows me that I am now monitoring all web applications in this specific subscription. So if we click down on that, we get all web apps. So now I can monitor for a set of resource conditions that occur for every web application. The final alert I wanted to mention is using log analytics. For those not aware, log analytics is the log aggregation part of the Azure Monitor suite. So what you can do is configure your Azure Monitor metrics to be pushed into your log analytics workspace. And you can then query them to do things like aggregating across lots of different resources, joining different resource types together, doing more complex queries than you might be able to do with Azure Monitor. You can also keep the data for a lot longer. So the maximum retention time for log analytics is 2 years. Rather than 90 days for Azure Monitor. Log Analytics lets you write queries to do whatever you want using the custom query language. So we've got a fairly simple one here where we're saying, okay, give me a list of all the VMs where the CPU is over 90%. Similar to what we do in the monitor, but we've written our own query here. And we could amend this query to say, okay, well actually, give me a list of all the machines that are over 90% for CPU, but also above 90% in memory, or something like that. So you can make the query more complicated. But what we can do here is we can configure an alert based on this log query. So we can pretty much write any queries we want, and then we can come in and click New Alert Rule, and that'll take us back to the same interface. This time it's looking at the Log Analytics workspace, and then you see here we've got this red exclamation mark because we haven't configured the alert yet. So it's whenever the custom log search is greater than undefined, so we need to go and have a look at that. So what we're saying is, ideally, in a normal situation, this query that says get me CPUs that are above 90% should return no record. There shouldn't be any machines that are reporting to that workspace that are above 90%. So what we want to do is say is, okay, well, if that is greater than 0, I need you to send me an alert, because now we have machines where a CPU is greater than 90. So see there, we've done a similar thing to what we did with the alert previously, where we're monitoring every single VM that reports into this workspace. We don't have to configure that individually, but we're saying whenever that is greater than 0, so any machine reports in that its CPU is greater than 90%, then we want an alert. Everything else then is the same. We can configure the action groups and everything else and so on, but it's now using our custom log query rather than the built-in Azure metric queries. So you can use this to do much more powerful things if you need them. Obviously, the simplest approach is to use the Azure Monitor queries out of the box, but if you need to do something more complicated, you can use Log Analytics to do that. Obviously, bear in mind there is some extra cost to that. When you start importing your metrics into Log Analytics, you're going to pay a cost for storing those. You'll also notice that the custom log query, the alert monthly cost, is more than it was for the one we did off the metrics endpoint. So there is an additional cost there. So do bear that in mind. The cheapest and simplest way to do it will be to use Azure Metrics, but if you need the custom stuff, then Log Analytics can do that for you. That's all there really is to configuring alerts on your subscription. I hope that was useful, and I'll see you next time on Azure Snippets.